In October of 1347, 12 ships arrived in Sicily, the largest of the Italian islands. The ships came from the Black Sea, and as they docked at the port of Messina, the people were in for a big surprise. A majority of the sailors were already dead, and those that remained were extremely sick and were covered in these strange black boils. The local authorities, without hesitation, ordered the ships out of the port. Little did they know the damage had already been done. Over the course of just 5 years, the plague would kill more than 30% of the European population, with some estimates going as far as 60 or 20 to 50 million people. Before we look into the Black Death, I think it would be a good idea to look into what the plague is in general and how it was transmitted. The interesting thing is, this was not the first outbreak of this disease. In 541 AD, in the Byzantine period, the plague of Justinian would be the first well-documented case of the plague. Emperor Justinian I ruled at this time, and it is said around 10,000 people died each day in Constantinople, known now as modern Istanbul, Turkey. Ancient historians at the time claimed that around 50% of Europe's population was said to have been killed off by the plague, and that the plague disappeared in the 8th century. It is important to note that the Black Death was the most effective in the 14th century, but the plague has been around for thousands of years. The first ever recorded case of the plague was in ancient China in 224 BC. The cause of the plague was a mystery for the longest time, and funny enough, another outbreak in China would solve this case. The relatively recent outbreaks of the bubonic plague happened in China and in India in 1855, but it lasted up to 1959. Luckily, in 1894, the first medical breakthrough happened in Hong Kong, where researchers found the bacteria responsible. It was the rod-shaped bacteria known as Yersinia pestis. A couple years later, Chinese doctors realized that the humans were not the only ones that could be infected. Rats showed the same symptoms. They also noticed that the majority of people infected by Yersinia pestis had flea bites. In fact, a lot of animals were found to contain the plague, such as mice, rabbits, and squirrels. But out of all these plague-carrying animals, the black rat was found to be the most dangerous, as it is known to live close to people. It is believed that as the black rat populations were wiped out from the plague, the fleas had to seek out their next food source, thereby transferring the plague to humans. There are 3 types of the plague. The bubonic plague is the most common of the 3. The plague is transmitted from the bite site and travels to a lymph node in the body. The plague takes around 3 to 5 days to develop before you start to feel sick. The first symptoms of the bubonic plague are headaches, fever, and weakness. The reason it is called the bubonic plague is because of swelling lymph nodes called buboes around the groin, armpits, and neck. The septicemic plague is caused when the infection spreads into the bloodstream. There is also the possibility of internal bleeding and can cause the skin and organs to turn black and die. This blackness of the skin is most notable on the fingers, hands, and the nose. You can also catch this plague from infected flea bites or by handling an infected animal. Lastly is the pneumonic plague, which is caused when the infection spreads to the lungs. It can happen in one of 2 ways: by inhaling droplets of the plague from another infected person, by coughing, or can develop from the bubonic or septicemic plague if it is left untreated. For 80% of cases, when left untreated, it takes around 6 to 10 days to die. If you include the full contagion cycle, which would include rat populations, fleas, and humans, it would go something like this. The fleas infected with Yersinia pestis would feed on the rat populations, where the rats would act as a form of transportation for the plague. The rats would get sick, and most of the rat colony would be killed off within 10 to 14 days. The fleas have now lost their main food source, and now seek out their next meal. Since the black rat is used to humans, the fleas are close to the next target. From start to finish, it takes around 20 days or so for the fleas to bite the rats and carry the infection to the first human victim. It is important to note that this is what is commonly believed to have spread the Black Death through the use of migrating rats. But there is still an open debate on whether this is the case. In an article published in National Geographic, it talks about a study in a PNAS journal that claims the rats were not the main spreaders of the plague, and instead were human parasites, such as lice and human fleas. Their study found that the human fleas and lice bit an already infected human and transferred it person to person. What do you guys think were the main spreaders of the plague? Could it be the rat flea theory or the human flea theory? Or maybe it was a combination of both? Let me know in the comments. Now that we covered a little bit of background on the plague, we can learn about the worst case of the Black Death ever recorded in the medieval 14th century. Let's look into how the Black Death likely appeared in the medieval times. The origins of the plague likely came from Central Asia, from Lake Issyk-Kul. The reason this location is suspected to be the main initial cause is that archaeological excavations have shown a high death rate around the years 1338 and 1339. There were also memorial stones placed that linked the deaths to the plague. What is also interesting about this spot, it was near the Silk Road trade routes and was easily accessible from China and the Caspian Sea. But it is still hard to confirm as the origin of the plague, as other sources claim the plague came to China as early as the 1320s. It is possible China was infected first, and then it spread up the Silk Road to Lake Issyk-Kul. It is just hard to say. As for how the plague spread to India, it isn't likely that it came from the lake and traveled south through the mountains of Tibet. A more reasonable theory is it reached India from the Chinese ship trading routes. The Black Death did make its way to the Middle East, reaching Mecca, the holy city, but it is not clear on how it got there. The plague reached Mecca in 1349, just 1 year after Europe was consumed by the plague. Maybe the plague came to Mecca from Europe, who knows? The next important event that likely spread the plague into Europe was the Siege of Kaffa. In 1344, the Mongolian Golden Horde wanted to take back the Crimean port city of Kaffa from the Genoese, in which the Christian Italian traders took the town in the late 1200s. The Mongolian siege lasted until 1347 because the reinforcements brought the Black Death with them. Gabriele de Mussis, an Italian lawyer, supposedly recorded the events that followed. The whole army was infected by a disease which overran the Tartars and killed thousands upon thousands every day. He also said that the Mongolian leader ordered corpses to be placed in catapults and lobbed into the city in hopes that the intolerable stench would kill everyone inside. The Siege of Kaffa is known by modern historians as the first use of biological warfare in history, but there are some problems with his account at Kaffa. In fact, it doesn't seem he left his home in the city of Acenza in northern Italy. I mean, the tactic of lobbing diseased corpses into the fortress is a brilliant strategy and seems very plausible, but there were no scholars at the time that mentioned dead corpses being catapulted at Kaffa. A French churchman, Gilles Lemussis, wrote that the Mongolians were surprised when the Christians in Kaffa got sick. Regardless of what actually happened, the Italian merchants did flee on their ships, taking the Black Death with them back to Europe. The ships from Kaffa arrived at Genoa, but the disease was contained as they were quickly repelled. But the same thing can't be said for Messina, which I mentioned at the beginning of the video. The same ships were able to dock, allowing the rats on board to climb down the ship ropes and spread the plague. The merchant ships were then kicked out of the port, and they spread the Black Death to Marseille, France, and along the coast of Spain to Barcelona and Valencia, and continued throughout Europe. Just think, a few merchant ships sealed the fate for most of Europe. When the plague wreaked havoc on the European population, society started to break down. No one had any idea on how the plague was transmitted or how to cure the infected. The practice of medicine in the medieval ages still came from the Greeks' four humors theory. The idea was that the body consisted of four humors: yellow bile, phlegm, black bile, and blood. If any of the four humors were off balance, a disease would appear. In order to combat the imbalance of humors, they resorted to draining what they thought was excess blood in the body, and used various herbs. These techniques were used to try and cure the Black Death, which failed. Bacteria and viruses were not known in the Medieval Ages. Now just imagine being a regular Joe at the time. Everyone in your own town is sick or dying, and your doctors, which can be seen as the higher authority, have no idea on how to stop the plague. It would feel like the end of the world. To make matters worse, the Roman Catholic Church wasn't able to calm down the social hysteria. The church played a crucial role in the Medieval Ages. They were part of the small few that could actually read or write. The church was the authority of the time and effectively had control on what to believe, as their words came from God. With this much power, it is not a shock it was abused. The Roman Catholic Church believed that all illnesses were punishments from God. They believed the sick had sinned. Those that tried to find medical cures for the plague not approved by the church, were at risk of being labeled heretics. So in a way, the church put a halt to medical progress. The church was a powerful entity that a majority of peasants followed blindly or were in fear of speaking up. But during the Black Death, the church's reputation changed. As the outbreak of the plague raged on, many people were sick and dying than the church could help. They stopped proper burial practices and opted for mass graves. The priests that tried to help often got sick themselves, so the church needed more qualified priests. But that didn't exactly happen, as the new priests were not ready for an outbreak of this scale. The church started demanding money for their services, even though none of their cures worked. The church did not keep up to their promises, and as a result, more and more peasants started questioning the church. With the church and doctors losing a lot of their reputation, the rest of the population had to look elsewhere. In a panic to find a cure, very strange ideas came about. Some thought the plague was caused by planetary alignments and natural disasters. Some thought there was a smelly vapor in the air that needed to be cleaned up by loud noises and other measures, known later as the miasma theory. Others thought moderation was the key to curing the plague. They formed small communities away from the sick and ate the best food and drank the finest wine. They avoided talking about the plague and just enjoyed themselves as much as they thought was reasonable. Some people did the exact opposite. They ate and drank as much as they could and partied all day long as they thought being happy was the cure to the plague. They too avoided the sick. One of the most horrible massacres to be committed during the plague was the purging of heretics and other undesirables from 1348 to 1349, where as many as 1,000 Jews were slaughtered by angry mobs, which led to thousands more fleeing to the less populated areas in Eastern Europe. Whether you were of nobility or just a simple serf, the plague affected everyone. Bodies piled up to the point that they filled the houses and streets. People avoided their friends and family and gave up hope altogether. Groups such as the flagellants, that were once seen as religious extremists, became popular as the alternative. The church was seen of no use. The flagellants believed that the plague came from God's wrath, and by whipping themselves from town to town, they hoped to get rid of the world of sin. It didn't help that one of the reactions to the plague was an increase in crime and other sinful behavior, therefore justifying the flagellants' actions even more. The flagellants may have believed they were helping the people, but it is very likely that through the worship of whipping themselves, they may have carried diseases and the Black Death with them as they traveled. On the other hand, the flagellant movement may have been the boost of morale the population needed to carry on living in this harsh world. So how was life after the outbreak of the plague? The Black Death claimed millions of lives by this point, but just as it appeared, it quickly died down in the 1350s. As to why the plague declined, it could be said that maybe the plague killed too many for its own good, as thinning the human population made it harder for it to spread. Changes in immune genes may have helped also. Life in post-plague Europe was quite different. The quality of life improved. Since a big chunk of the human population was wiped out, there was a shortage of labor, meaning the employees were desperate for workers. Before, serfs had little to no say when it came to labor, but after the plague, they could go elsewhere for work if the pay wasn't good enough. Researchers from the Museum of London compared bones from before and after the plague and found that the post-plague bones showed an improved diet of foods such as meat and fish, as well as better quality bread. So, in the long term, the people were going to live on, but the survivors lost most of their friends and family in the process. All in all, the Black Death was a cruel event in history, a killing machine that no one at the time could understand. The Black Death of 1346 to 1353 has stood as one of the worst pandemics in human history. I think it needs to be clear that the Black Death never truly went away. It would flare up for the centuries to come. One most notable instance was the Great Plague of London, which lasted from 1665 to around 1666. As for today, in the modern world, the Black Death is curable with the use of antibiotics, but for some places less fortunate, the plague is still a threat, just like it was in those years past. Thanks for watching. If you are still interested in hearing more about the Black Plague, there is tons more history to cover, like the Plague of London in the 1600s. It would make for a great topic for a future video. If you liked the video, leave a like, and if you haven't, subscribe for more history content, and I'll see you guys in the next video.